So during this portion of the season, right after it, there's a lot of evaluation to do. There's a lot of things to think about. And I like to bring in guests and people who have expertise in different areas so we can talk about different things that are wrong with the team and what could go right with the team in the future. And to do that, I'm bringing in a writer at the OBR, Jack Duffin. You can follow him on Twitter at Jack Duffin. Jack is a salary cap expert. He really focuses in on that aspect of it. And it's one of the biggest mysteries in sports. Like, I don't like any sport. The salary cap seems to be as big of a mystery as like your local tax code.
I'll get to the point. There's parts of salary cap even I don't even try to understand. I'd say it's about trying to get to about 50%, so that the basis of it makes sense. And then, yeah, you can go down an absolute rabbit hole. And you've got sort of like three teams there. You've got the Eagles, the Browns, and the Saints do all sorts of crazy stuff where even people that cover the salary cap just turn around and go, sorry, what? And then we have to catch up with what the teams are doing.
Yeah. It was like what I remember the first year void years started hitting like on every team, and it was like, oh, what you can do? Because I remember that year the Saints were like negative 70 in the cap, and wherever I was like, well, they got to start trading people, right? And they're like, nah, we'll just restructure everybody and get into void years. And I guess that's one of the things, right, that like me as somebody who kind of like watches the cap and tries to figure it out, I have a hard time figuring out is like who is restructurable and who is not, right? Because I hear a lot of people say, hey, we can just restructure Deshaun's contract or we can restructure Myles Garrett. Is it really like this is magic button you could hit, or is there something that in the contract that lets you know, okay, this is eligible? Like, is it dead money? Like, what do you look at to know if something is restructurable?
Yeah, so it's basically just looking at any money they're due this season in cash. And then can you just pay it up front in a signing bonus and spread it back? I'd say the best analogy is a credit card. If you get a credit card, you are not suddenly rich. You haven't just magicked all this money. You've got to pay for it down the line. And what that means is, hey, you get the money you can spend now, and then you just spend less money in the future because you're paying off that credit card. So it's not like interest on it, but it is money you're borrowing from the future to pay for the now. And it is that balancing game. So, hey, you could create 90 million with a load of restructures, but suddenly you lose 30 million of your cap spending next year, like 30 million year after. So you're just borrowing. Is probably the best way to look at it.
It's like debt reconsolidation, right? Where it's like you get a big loan to pay off like some of the interest on the debt, but you end up having to pay, a larger loan at the end of the day, but you can split it up in different ways. So it's just a different way of paying that debt. I guess would probably be the best way to explain it, the most relatable way to explain it.
Yeah, it's just there's no interest though. So it's not like you're paying, 5% on top of it. It's all the same, but it's one way you can do loads of that. But if you go too far, the Saints are probably the perfect example. Suddenly you get to the point where you've paying for loads of guys that aren't on your roster anymore, and you have to blow it up. And they got rid of their entire middle tier. They got rid of their starting left tackle. Those are premium positions that you don't then want to get rid of. So it's a balancing game, because in the same way Tom Brady was like, actually, the Patriots have blown the cap. They've traded loads of assets for guys. I want to get out of here and go to a team which, like the Bucks, hey, built for success, just didn't have a quarterback. And then he went there. And the last thing you want is Deshaun Watson after 5 years going, hey, I don't want to extend here because they've blown the cap. They've traded all their picks. I'm going to go to a team where I can compete for it. So that's it's why you need to balance. You can be aggressive, just don't be gun-ho and crazy.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting whenever we talk about like the cap and anything like that. We do it theoretically so often that we don't really consider like, okay, well, if we do this like this, then what are the odds that this thing actually does blow up, or what if this doesn't work here, or does this actually fit with certain people in the locker room? And when you look at the Browns salary cap situation this offseason, just give me a basic overview of what you see, what the problems you see forthcoming are for them, and what are some of the good things that they have with their cap situation, if any.
Yeah, so they're in minus 14 million roughly, but they'll restructure Deshaun Watson. As soon as that deal was signed, one of my first tweets went, they're going to restructure that next year. If you could bet on it, I would be betting everything I had on that restructure. But what they're going to do, they're going to wait until after Lamar Jackson's tagged. because if they do it before, Lamar Jackson's tag's lower because it's the average of the top 5 salaries. So they're going to wait a little bit longer, screw the Ravens, and then they'll restructure it because, hey, you've got to game that stuff out. But there's enough money to do stuff. But if you look at the offensive side of the ball, there's like 9 guys if they extend DPJ that are going to be on 10 million plus. And that is not what most teams do. They usually have maybe 4, 5, 6 guys, never that many. So when people are going, oh yeah, just add another 20 million wide receiver, let's add this. There's not much space on the offensive side of the ball to add a big piece. A lot of what you see there is going to be there, and you need to look to the draft. Whereas on the defensive side of the ball, there is space around. If they move off of John Johnson, I think that's one that he'll probably get a post-June 1st cut. And they've got to decide by the 17th of March because he's due a roster bonus that day of $1 million. So that's just something in a player's contract to make the decision really early, either let me go or keep me. So stuff to keep in mind there. But I think they're going to be sensible and spread that money around because you could bring in sort of 5 starters on the defense, whether that's Anthony Walker returning, or you could just spend all that money on Deron Payne. And why Deron Payne might be exciting, Deron Payne, Myles Garrett, and a load of Jags and rookies doesn't really give you what you want on a defensive line. Whereas if you had, say, 3 deep at edge, 3 deep at defensive tackle, suddenly you can consistently get pressure. So I think that's the much smarter route because you can't just have, hey, the 75% of snaps when Myles and Deron Payne are out there, amazing. We're having carnage. And then 25% of the time they're getting a breather because it's a rotation position. And you're relying on Winovich, Wright, Togiai, and Winfrey to get after the quarterback, because they're just going to run the field while Myles Garrett and Deron Payne are just getting a quick breather.
Yeah, and I don't think we've been here as a franchise, right, where we've paid a quarterback, right? So this is like new territory for almost everybody. And like even if you follow other teams, unless you're following them really closely, this is the kind of intricate stuff that teams have to do to work around quarterback contracts. Like I remember, just because I went to school near Pittsburgh, I would hear about all the stuff Pittsburgh would do with Ben's contract. Like every year, they convert most of it to a signing bonus and then add years and lot. And that's kind of why he had that like funky last couple of years of his career where he kind of just played it out. But there's a lot that you have to do now to maximize your roster when you have somebody the caliber and the pay of Deshaun Watson on it. And Andrew Berry does things differently, but like what do you expect, or how do you expect this team to move now, and how differently it's going to be now that they have to kind of work around that?
Yeah, it's sort of more or less, I think it was 3 years ago, Dee Podesta said, hey, as soon as you get a franchise quarterback, the whole roster building stuff, you almost have a manual for building a roster with a rookie QB, and you have a completely different picture of what you're doing with franchise quarterback. Because, hey, the minute Joe Burrow is going to cost the Bengals an extra $40 million a year, all of those fun pieces like Trey Hendrickson, any of these other guys, you just have to get rid of them because you can't afford them all. And that's the balancing act that you've got there. So I think it wouldn't surprise me if for the next 2 years they go really aggressive, not crazy going, hey, let's add Hopkins, let's add Deron Payne and Jesse Bates and we'll make it work. But keeping the money they have on the offense isn't really super sustainable long term, but they might just go, let's just push it for 2 years and we'll deal with some of that in the future. But that's keeping it the way it is. And then I just think it's not going to be the splash signings. The guys that you see like 10 million plus, I don't think you're going to be in that scope. Lots of people are looking for, where's the Amari Cooper this year? Adding a guy that costs 20 million a year has consequences. We were able to do it because we weren't paying anyone in the wide receiver room last year. Well, suddenly if you've got Donovan Peoples-Jones on 12.5 million, it's not like you can just pop another 15, 20 million a year wide receiver in there and go, hey, we can pay 50 million to three wide receivers, all this money to the quarterback, the O-line. It's the balancing act. And everything with the salary cap, it's all opportunity cost. You can do A or you can do B. It's not one where it's not stopping you doing A or B, but when you do one, suddenly you're spending the budget from the other position. So stuff like paying a backup running back 6.25 million is not going to happen moving forward. It's going to keep that money in the starters, but you also need to hit on free agency, cheaper guys. And people think money means more success. We can look at Austin Hooper, they spent a lot of money on, and we can look at Pochich. He was signed to be a backup And he had a phenomenal season last year. So it's going to be cheaper and looking for those more middle of the roster. And hey, it's how the Pats had so much success. It wasn't the stars they brought in. They had one quarterback, and then they just had a really, really strong tier of sort of 3 to 6 million players. And you have several of them, and suddenly one injury, it's not the end of the world. It's a 3 million player rather than, hey, if you sign Deron Payne and that's your cure for the defensive side of the ball, you lose Deron Payne for a week or he's out for the rest of the season. The Bills, when they lost Von Miller, suddenly their playoff odds started to drop because they couldn't get any pressure. So you can put all your eggs in one basket, but what happens when that guy gets injured? And you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and it's with when you pay that quarterback, I think it's even more important to have some kind of stability with the front office and with the head coaching staff, because I think the reason the Browns have drafted so poorly, like pre-2018, was because they were consistently changing out coaches. And when you're consistently changing out coaches, I think the thing that sometimes some fans don't get is you are consistently changing the criteria in which the players you're looking for. So now you always have this mismatch of a roster. It's like a college football team, right? If you keep changing out coaches, you have this guy's recruits for these 2 years and then this mix with this guy, and you're trying to put a team together that was never supposed to be together. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is, like, the Browns were able to draft well with like some late round picks, like Martin Emerson, right, for example, is somebody they got played really well. And I think they are able to make that kind of a pick because they're like, okay, we've been in this defense for a little while now. We know that this guy, he's going to be asked to do this in this defense, and he can do this in that defense. We know that. We've scouted that. We've got guys that could do that before. The same thing works on offense, where it's like, hey, maybe you can get a Donovan Peoples-Jones, even though that was really early in the Stefanski era. But the same principle applies. It's like, okay, we got DPJ in the 6th round because we thought he was good at this, this, and this. Turned out he was good at this. That really works for this offense. Maybe we don't need the speed guy. That's probably what influenced the decision to go David Bell here, right? Because they're like, okay, well, David's pretty similar profile to DPJ. He can get open, but not really a big separator. So that can work in this offense. We'll go draft a guy like that. And that's really where you find your fixes when you have a quarterback like that, is 2nd, 3rd round, right? Like, just trying to find starters in that area. Like, hey, every once in a while you hit on the 1st round pick and that's great and you get a superstar out of that. Or maybe you're able to convince a star to take a little bit less money to come to you in free agency. But the bones of this rebuild, well, not even rebuild, the bones of maintaining a roster with the quarterback, I mean, you look anywhere that's done it successfully, it's about those guys in the draft, right? Figuring out those positions. And late round drafting really only works at a good enough clip when you have enough information about what you're looking for, because you're talking about guys on the edges at that point. So AB, he's done an interesting job with the draft. Some people think he's done a good job. Bad job. I think he's done a really good job when you look at it in totality, everything he's done here. You mentioned that he's kind of ahead of the curve, too, with how they structure things, how they re-sign guys. One of the contracts that was kind of an interesting one that rose a lot of eyebrows was this Jack Conklin extension. Well, what do you think that extension says about, well, one, Jack Conklin, but two, what they feel about some of the other pieces on this team?
Yeah, it was certainly saying Hudson's not ready to be a right tackle. I think that's the clearest picture you get from that, because if they're like, hey, we let go of JC Treader because we felt good about Nick Harris, they obviously don't feel that way, like Hudson's ready to just step in and be the team's right tackle. It's a lot of money. And I think you've had 3 very different years of Conklin. You had the first year, which was great. He was so good then, and you were like, wow, we've really uncovered a gem. You had the second year, which was just full of injuries. And then you had the bad experience where this was why the Titans wanted to let him go, because they couldn't rely on him. And then the third year, you had above average. There was some great stuff. There was somewhere he was still getting there. And that, a lot, you have to rely on the medical. So it's kind of, they paid him somewhere between he's good but not great, and then the best season, and they're hoping for something in there. Obviously, if they get the injury and Hudson's forced to go and play the whole year because he goes down week 1, that's obviously the fear, and it's more realistic. Obviously, any player could get injured. And I think it says something about Wills, because if they were going to go out and give Wills a massive contract this year, you're probably not paying the right tackle as well. Not when you've got the two most expensive guards the NFL's ever seen. So that's definitely a factor. And I think certainly in the way of drafting and developing guys, lots of people focus on the draft as if there is some secret formula. If you look at any team, no team is consistently good at drafting. Not a single one. Not Bill Belichick, not the Saints had that sort of fantastic year when everything was like an all-pro, and that doesn't sustain. And the other part is, well, player development. If Mahomes or Josh Allen were coached by Hugh Jackson and Freddie Kitchens, are we really saying those two guys are in MVP discussions? I'll just be honest and say probably not. Josh Allen probably wouldn't have developed into the way he did because it was a big transition for him to go from where he was. And so the GMs can pick a guy that should be great, and the coaches can just destroy that guy. And there is that balancing act that people think it's just the GM and whoever drafts them, that guy would be incredible. Where they play, where they develop, and who they're coached by has such a big impact on what players turn out to be. But if you can fill your middle of the roster with guys that you're picking on sort of day 3 of the draft, suddenly you get an extra 4-5 million off each of those guys. You spend extra on a starter, and that's kind of what I think they're hoping to do. Spend loads of money on starters and draft the guys under them that, hey, if your 3rd, 4th edge defensive tackle are dirt cheap, suddenly you can spend more on your starter.
Now, that's something interesting you bring up there with the offensive line is you do have this weird situation because I was assuming, okay, well, you probably let Conklin go in the offseason and then you can let, Hudson take over that role because there's a lot of money, right? You're talking about if we bring back Ethan Posick, that's a whole nother contract, right? We already have both the guards under giant deals. In like one of them's old, but he's the more reliable one in Joe Batonio. Wyatt Teller's been a little up and down since he's gotten that money. And then Jed Wills, who he's on his rookie deal covered for next year, but after that you start talking about 5th-year extension, and it's not an insignificant 5th-year extension because he was the 10th pick of the draft. I believe it's like $20 million, something like that. If correct me if I'm wrong there, but
just pull out. I think it's 12 because they changed the formula of it last year or the year before. So it's just based on Pro Bowls and all sorts of stuff. His option, it's jumped up on their calculation, $14.75 million. So it's a $15 million commitment. They've got to pay that or not.
Yeah, and like with Jed Wills, I run into this thing with like, there are players in the NFL that everybody like they tend to be like fan base's least favorite players because they're good enough to make you furious, right? And Jed Wills, he's kind of that caliber tackle where it's like he's not a top 10 tackle, he's not a Pro Bowl tackle, but he is a starting tackle. But you feel like he could be more. And I think the same thing happens with like Bengals fans in Cincinnati when they talk about Jonah Williams because he's very much, and it's funny, it's another Alabama tackle that went from right to left, where it's like, man, you feel like you should get more out of him, but like that's kind of just how it rolls with these Alabama guys at the offensive line. Like you just always kind of feel that way. But with him, it's like Jed Wills is the kind of guy you keep under the rookie deal. I don't know if you extend a Jed Wills, right? Because then that's when you're talking about the market could be anywhere with the left tackle. Somebody can decide they're going to push up that price dramatically. Like, I don't know what the number is, but I would just be like, hey, Jed, good luck with that, man. But it's not like an absorbently high number, right? Like it's like, oh, if this gets inconvenient, I don't feel like keeping it. And I wouldn't even want to give him a long-term deal just because of that. So you run into a situation where Jed's going to get more expensive in a couple years. You have a very expensive guard who's 33 at this point. He's getting up there in age. You have a center that you might bring back, but you also like that situation is a tricky one, right? Because Ethan Posick was like legitimately like almost playing at an all-pro level. It's almost a no-brainer to keep him, but he wasn't supposed to start. And Nick Harris was, but he tore apart his knee during the preseason. So it's like, what do? Do you just let him walk and just say, we're going to roll the dice on Nick Harris? It would be a fiscally responsible thing to do, but it's like, also you got to protect your quarterback. And it's like, what do you do there? I don't know, because what's the point of having Nick Harris on the roster at that point if you're just going to keep Ethan Posick? But like, they got a lot to figure out there. That's going to be a tough one, because also Wyatt Teller is paid. Also, you decided to pay Jack Conklin in the middle of the season. Like, it seems like they have a lot of money wrapped up in the offensive line, to the point to where, unless this is the greatest offensive line that God's ever seen on earth, it's not going to be worth it. And when you put yourself in a cap position like that, that's usually where things go wrong. Like, do you see them kind of trying to get out of certain guys' contracts, like within the next few years, to either rebuild and restash his offensive line? Because this is not sustainable.
No, it's certainly not sustainable. And I think Pocic for me is not coming back, especially with that Conklin deal. You're looking at like probably $5.5–6 million a year, and that's a lot of money. And you think whoever you're putting in that spot, they're going to have potentially a Hall of Famer to their left. They've got a guy that, especially for the first half of the season, plays like an all-pro, just above average in the second half the last 2 years, but both really good guys. He's got a coach in Bill Callahan. I feel pretty secure that you can put someone in there. And as well, it's going to be really attractive. Pocic could have been signed by any team last offseason, and every team in the NFL said he's not good enough to start. And then the Browns signed him for basically just above a min. So if there is a guy that misses out on joining another team, and where's this agent going to call first? He's going to call Cleveland and go, hey, can I sign my guy to be the backup, compete with Nick Harris? Well, I want him in there because he's going to develop and get better. So that's something to keep in mind. And hey, if you pay $5 million there, where are we getting that $5 million extra from? And then part of the benefit of having a coach for me like Bill Callahan should be that he elevates talent. And we saw Froholt, and lots of Browns fans don't like Froholt. Let's look at the 4 games he had at right guard, because he's not a centre. He was asked to play out of position as the 4th choice centre after everyone else got injured. He actually played really, really well. Got a 70.0 grade for PFF, but really good in his 4 games there. And suddenly, this is a guy off the street. I think the year before that, Dunn just rolled in there, done really well when he was asked to play at guard. So we've got this consistent play of above average guard play. Why are we paying $10 million plus to Wyatt Teller is my question, because if Bill Callahan is doing his magic and you can get Froholt to be a good player, well, that's $10 million that you could go spend on your other wide receiver. And it's why when people have gone, hey, let's trade for Hopkins, let's trade for all these other guys, it's like, fine, we can give up the 2nd, 3rd round pick, whatever it's going to cost. But where's the money coming from to pay him? And I've always said Wyatt Teller probably makes the most sense of going, you can re-sign someone like Froholt to $2 million a year, and then you can go and take that $10 million saved and put that into wide receiver. So I would just roll with it the way it is. But for me, Teller's the one that makes the most sense. If you're going to move him on, move him, because first half of the season has been phenomenal, and then injury or other issues, we've seen a reduction in the second half.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting, too, in the draft, because I think AB usually tries to stay a couple years ahead of whatever he's doing, right? So he makes some moves where, like, in the moment, you're like, why'd you draft Jerome Ford, right? And then all of a sudden, the season starts, and you're like, oh, okay, they're going to be moving off Kareem Hunt. That's what the move is there, right? Like, it's one of those things like most franchises do, but it's kind of new here where, like, we've not had somebody stay that long. We're like, oh, there's a plan. There's a plan why this happens. I think one of those things are going to happen. The more I think about that cap situation at offensive line is we might draft more offensive linemen than people are expecting, right? Like, even with Nick Harris, like if you bring him back, it's not really a long-term solution because he's going to be at the end of his rookie deal, right? He's only played like 1 year on that deal. So, even if you do bring him back and you expect him to start, like, you still got to figure that out for next year, because if you're not going to re-sign Posick, you're not re-signing Nick Harris. So then you end up in this spot where it's like, okay, well, what do you do, right? You don't want to be empty-handed. They're probably going to draft a center in this draft, and I would think relatively, like, not early, but like I think they would have some kind of eyes for like, hey, if this guy drops here, we're going to want to take him. Like, they're going to have some guys that they're going to highlight there. I don't think they're going to take him like with the 2nd round pick or something like that, unless like somebody crazy drops to him. I don't even know who that prospect would be. But if they see a guy they like, they're going to take a center, right? They might take a guard because you probably should. Well, they feel either you feel like you have the guard on the roster, or you feel like you want to develop somebody to be ready for next year, because one of them got to shake at that position. If you're going to plan on keeping Conklin, or if you don't plan on keeping Conklin and you don't think that Hudson's there, then you got to have a new plan for that, right? Like there might be some moves made along the offensive line that we aren't really thinking about right now because of the like if you look at the Browns' whole cap situation, I would say that offensive line is probably the most unstable part of it, where it's like, okay, this can't go on for that long. So I think that's probably what he's going to focus on. Some in this draft is like, okay, I got to get some guys on rookie deals here, in order to keep this thing rolling. And it's part of just figuring out, okay, in this offense, what's really important, right? You know, Kyle Shanahan is a master at this, right? Of figuring it out, where it's like, hey, I need a really good left tackle. Like, I need a dude at tight end, and I need probably a guy at guard. And everybody else, I can work with that, right? Like wide receiver, I can get a couple guys here. I can work it without wide receivers as long as they listen to me. Or I can get a guy like Deebo Samuel, or I can get a guy like Christian McCaffrey, right? And I think that's one of the most important parts, and why they didn't really make a radical change at defense, because they're like, we figured that we got some guys at certain positions we've been drafting for this style of a wide 9 defense for a while. We don't want to completely throw that out the window to switch to a 3-4. And it's kind of like that sort of thinking that I don't think we're at yet, because everybody's like, we need to draft a wide receiver or my favorite skill guy that's going to be available, you know, and there's different ways of moving about this that I think they're going to think about.
I'd say the one question I had, left tackle, I think, has got a very high chance. And people look at the offseason, they start with the draft. It's the worst place you can start, because you've got to do it chronologically. So you've got to look at that free agency first. They're going to fill all their needs in free agency. By the time free agency finishes going into the draft, they're going to be happy with their 53-man roster. And then it's about drafting, as you said, for the future. So left tackle is massively important in the draft, because if there's a guy they like there, maybe in the second round, they're going to go stick him behind Wills for a year and go, this guy could potentially start next year. Whether they pick up the option or not for Wills, because they can still trade him off. Cam Robinson's being paid something like $17 million a year. So bad tackles are always in demand. And then you've got Dawson Deaton. Who knows what that guy and how they view him, because he's been out all season, sort of a guard/center. And then wide receiver. Amari Cooper's got 2 years left on his deal. There is very little chance that he would be extended, because by that point he's gone over 30. They probably don't want to commit that money to him at that point. So now's almost a year where you go, hey, if there's a guy we really like in the second round, actually, we'll draft a wide receiver, because this guy can be the wide receiver 3 this year, but he's ready in 2025 to come in and be the number 1. And you've almost got to think that far out. If you've got a first round pick, easy. You can go and draft a guy like 1 year out, but you almost need to plan 2 years out, the same way they did with Nick Harris. When that pick was made, I tweeted straight away. I was like, hey, JC Treader, 2 years left and he's gone. And people were really, really unhappy. But it's like, that's exactly what they're sat there in the front office doing. And the draft is more for 2024 through to the next 8 years, whereas free agency is for the now. So people will fix free agency on all their holes there, and then the draft's about what are the key pieces of a roster in the future. And it's a quarterback. We've got that. It's a cornerback. We've got that. We need another edge. We need another wide receiver. And I'd say we need a left tackle. We've got okay, but that's not a franchise left tackle for the next 8 years.
Well, I could sit here and ask a bunch of questions, but we'll be here forever. Got to have you back on again, Jack Duffin. He's a writer for the OVR Cap Specialist. Follow him at Jack Duffin to stay up to date on all of your Browns Caps things and just your Browns things in general. Jack, I want to thank you for coming on. Appreciate you. Everybody else, have a great day. Have a good night.